My name is Helen Brooks. I'm 69 years old, a retired librarian living in Providence. Most of my days are quiet now, surrounded by books and a small garden. But one evening, not long ago, at exactly 5:45 during my daughter's wedding reception, I felt something inside me break. I was standing by the edge of the ballroom, watching the guests laugh and toast, when I overheard my daughter's voice. She wasn't speaking to me, but about me her words sharp, dismissive, as if I were a burden to be managed rather than a mother to be honored. In that instant, my hands shook and my heart sank. What she didn't know was that I held something powerful, hidden away. A letter from Jack, my late husband. His words had become my shield, my secret weapon. That night marked the beginning of a lesson. Dignity is not given, it's defended. And dignity often means planning with someone, not for them. Which brings me to the question of wealth and worth. I left Providence that morning on the 9 o'clock train, a navy dress folded carefully over my lap. By the time I stepped onto the platform in Westport, it was 10:10, the September air still holding a faint chill. My dress was plain, something I'd worn to church more than once, and I carried a small handbag with $18 tucked inside. The car ride up to the Grant estate felt like crossing into another world. When I arrived, it was impossible to ignore the grandeur iron gates opening to sprawling lawns, a white tent the size of a small stadium, and a floral display I later heard had cost $12,000. Everywhere I looked, there were gowns that shimmered under the sun, diamonds that caught the light like tiny explosions. A 12-piece orchestra tuned their instruments as 200 guests milled about, sipping champagne and crystal flutes. I felt myself shrink, my sensible shoes tapping against polished marble as I walked toward the ballroom. And then I saw Emily, my daughter. She was radiant, of course, but what pierced me was the dress she wore, my wedding gown, vintage lace I had once treasured as a symbol of love and beginnings. On her, it had been altered, styled, and displayed as though it were another accessory for status, a prop in a performance. I wanted to feel pride, but instead there was a quiet sting. That gown had once been the most precious thing I owned, stitched with hope. Now it seemed to belong to another world entirely. I found my seat near the back, smoothing my navy dress across my knees. The music swelled, conversations rose around me, and I sat there quietly, not yet knowing the wound I was about to carry from that night. It was some time after the cake had been cut when I found myself standing near the balcony doors, a glass of champagne in hand. That's when I heard it, my daughter's voice, low but clear, speaking to her friend Victoria. She spoke about me as though I were some failed experiment, a reminder of what she had worked so hard to escape. The words stung sharper than any blade. My hand tightened around the stem of the glass until I thought it might crack. I stood frozen, every syllable carving into me. A flood of memories surged, long nights working double shifts at the library, scrubbing floors after hours to cover her tuition, selling Jack's old guitar so she could have her music lessons. Every sacrifice that had once been love now felt dismissed, reduced to shame. And then, deep in my chest, I felt the weight of Jack's letter. He had written it during his final months, sealed it with instructions I was to keep it close, and read it only if I ever felt diminished by those we had given everything for. His handwriting still rested on that envelope inside my bag, steady and sure, even when his body had been failing him. I thought of opening it right there, tearing into the seal and letting his words pour out to defend me. But something stopped me. The time wasn't right. Instead, I slipped my hand into my purse, brushing the edge of the envelope, and drew in a long breath. I knew the letter wasn't just ink on paper. It was a voice waiting to be heard, a truth waiting for its moment. And I promised myself I would hold it until the right strike, the moment it could not be ignored. My place card had been set at a table near the back, angled just enough so I could see the dance floor but far from the center. It wasn't an accident. I knew the seating had been arranged carefully, and my chair was proof of where I stood in Emily's new world. From that distance, I watched her glide through the crowd. Her smile was flawless, her posture poised, every movement rehearsed for this stage. To the guests, she looked untouchable, the perfect bride. But as I watched, all I could see was the girl who once cried on my shoulder when rent was due, the young woman who leaned on me through heartbreaks, the daughter who begged me to sit with her during Jack's long nights of fever. Those memories lived inside me, while her eyes skimmed over me as if I were a stranger. When the orchestra struck the first notes of the father-daughter dance, the room shifted. My breath caught. Jack should have been there, steadying her steps, beaming with pride. Instead, a photo of him sat on a small table near the band, framed but ignored. Emily never even glanced in its direction. That cut deeper than anything she had said. I sat there, my chest tightening, until the music became too much. Quietly, I slipped away from the table and wandered into the library, where the noise of celebration softened into silence. The smell of old books grounded me, and I sank into a leather chair, pulling the envelope from my bag. Jack's letter rested in my hands, the paper warm as if it carried his pulse. I felt him there with me, urging patience. Not yet, but soon. For the first time that day, I knew I wouldn't stay silent forever. The library was a world apart from the noise outside. I slipped through the heavy oak doors and closed them behind me, leaving the laughter and music muffled in the distance. The room was grand, lined with shelves that stretched toward the ceiling, polished wood gleaming in the dim lamplight. It smelled faintly of leather and dust, like time itself had settled here. I couldn't help but think of the small-town library where I spent most of my working years. That place was modest, with creaky floors and chipped paint, but it held stories that fed people's souls. This library, for all its grandeur, felt hollow. From my bag, I pulled out the envelope. Jack's handwriting curved across the paper, familiar and steady, even in his final days. My fingers traced the ink as if I could touch him again. Surrounded by thousands of books, I held the single page that carried more weight than any volume on those shelves. I pressed it to my lap, letting the silence settle. I promised myself this letter would not stay buried. When the moment came, it would speak for him, for me, for dignity. After the wedding, life slipped back into its ordinary rhythm, but I couldn't quiet the restlessness in my chest. The laughter, the music, the sting of Emily's words, none of it had settled. I busied myself with gardening, errands, small chores, but the unease only grew sharper. One morning, I walked to the local library, the place where I had given most of my working years. Margaret, my old co-worker, greeted me with the same warm steadiness she always had. She didn't ask questions when I slid a scrap of paper across the desk with 2 words, Meadowbrook Manor. She simply nodded, and together we began. The reports came slowly, one stack at a time. State investigations into asset transfer programs, complaints buried in fine print, reviews from families who felt tricked, pamphlets dressed in bright smiles and promises of dignity, while the numbers told another story. I read of hidden fees, of residents' assets moved quietly under the guise of care planning. The words blurred, but the pattern became unmistakable. As I flipped through one glossy brochure, I remembered the lunch Emily had invited me to months earlier. Her sudden warmth, her insistence, the way she had pushed Meadowbrook like it was some shining opportunity. That day, I had wanted to believe her kindness was genuine. Now I saw the truth. She hadn't been seeing me as her mother. She had been seeing me as a problem to be managed, an account to be balanced. The anger simmered low and steady, not explosive, but sharp enough to keep me awake at night. I gathered copies, notes, pages clipped into a neat folder. If she tried again, I would not be caught off guard. Jack's letter was my shield, but now I carried proof too. I made myself a promise that afternoon if Emily pressed me once more, she would find a mother ready to fight. Emily invited me to lunch a few weeks after the wedding. I remember walking into the little bistro downtown, the one with chipped blue chairs and the smell of fresh basil drifting from the kitchen. She was already there, smiling wide, waving me over as if we were two old friends meeting after years apart. She ordered my favorite dish without even asking, grilled salmon with lemon butter, and poured me iced tea before I could lift the pitcher. She leaned in close, asked about my blood pressure, my sleep, even whether I was keeping up with my walks. Her voice was soft, warm, so unlike the clipped tone she used at the reception. For a moment, I wanted to believe this was her reaching back for me. But then came the shift. A casual mention of Meadowbrook Manor, wrapped in words like comfort and safety. She painted it as a retreat, a place where I could rest and not worry. As she spoke, I noticed the cadence, the rehearsed rhythm, the careful phrasing. It didn't sound like my daughter. It sounded like a brochure. I let her talk, nodding politely, but inside the air grew colder. I thought of the reports I had read, the hidden fees, the families caught in promises that turned sour. I saw the glint in her eye, not of love, but of calculation. This kindness was not care. It was a pitch. I sat quietly, chewing salmon that had turned dry in my mouth, letting her words wash over me. She thought I was pliable, that her warmth could undo what I already knew. But I was no longer the woman she imagined. I had Jack's letter, my own resolve, and now the truth. That day, I decided I would let her play her role, but I would not be moved. The invitation came on heavy cardstock, embossed with my daughter's new last name. It looked more like a business memo than a family note. A small gathering. It said, "Just us. A private room. Lunch provided." I knew before I arrived that something waited beneath the pleasantries. The dining room was staged with precision. A polished table, chairs drawn neatly into place, a small stack of papers sitting at the center like a silent centerpiece. Emily and her husband greeted me with smiles stretched too wide, their voices dipped in concern. It wasn't care, it was a performance. They called it an intervention. They spoke of Meadowbrook as though it were salvation, the only sensible choice. They said. Each word tightened the walls around me. I could feel their eyes pressing, as though my life, my independence, was theirs to rearrange. Inside, anger burned, but I kept my hands steady in my lap. I thought of Jack's letter, of the night he pressed it into my palm, whispering that there would come a day when I would need it. He had seen this moment before I could imagine it. A room where my daughter would no longer stand beside me, but across from me, siding with strangers to dictate my future. That realization cut deeper than the staged pitch. Emily was no longer my ally. She had chosen her place on the other side of the table. I breathed slow, let their words settle without reply. They thought my silence meant surrender. But inside, something shifted. I was no longer afraid of their plans. I would not let them write my story for me. This time, I would speak. And when I did, the truth would not be gentle. I placed the envelope on the table as though it were a final card in a long, quiet game. My fingers trembled, but my voice did not. I told them it was Jack's letter, written in his last weeks, and I began to read not word for word, but in the cadence of his voice, carried through mine. He reminded Emily of the years we scraped through bills so she could have piano lessons, the nights I worked double shifts while he fought through illness, the way every choice we made circled back to giving her chances we never had. And then, his warning never to treat her mother as a burden. He wrote that dignity was not a gift someone else bestowed. It was the one thing a person had to guard with their life. As I spoke, I felt him beside me. His presence steadied me more than any chair could. Then I placed a different stack on the table: printouts, state reports, complaint records from Meadowbrook Manor, pages that told their own story of exploitation, of residents stripped of assets in the name of care. My research laid bare what their sales pitch had tried to hide. For the first time, Emily's composure cracked. I saw it in the way her eyes darted to her husband, the silence that followed. The carefully staged concern dissolved, replaced by the weight of exposure. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth was louder than any argument. I ended with a simple statement, one that had been forming since the moment I heard her dismiss me as a failure. My life would not be signed away by anyone else. In that room, with Jack's words at my back and the receipts spread before us, I reclaimed what was mine: my dignity, my voice, my future. The room held a silence so heavy it seemed to press against my skin. Emily stared at the table, lips parted, searching for words that would not come. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, wrapped in excuses about misunderstanding and concern. But the weight of Jack's letter and the papers I had laid down made her explanations collapse under their own hollowness. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told them I was not a liability to be managed or a burden to be shifted. My life was my own, and I would decide how it was lived. The years of sacrifice had already written my worth, and no estate, no facility, no polite performance could erase it. There was no argument left, just a truth standing in the center of the room. I gathered my things, slid the envelope back into my bag, and rose. With each step toward the door, the air felt lighter. I wasn't leaving defeated. I was leaving whole. Therapy became my first step forward. Sitting across from a woman who listened without judgment, I began to see the patterns I had carried for years, how sacrifice had blurred into silence, how love had sometimes meant erasing myself. Each session gave me back a piece of my voice. I started reaching out, calling Margaret, an old coworker, and even a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Their warmth reminded me that I was still valued, still loved. The loneliness that had pressed so tightly against me began to loosen. Small joys returned, too. My garden filled my hands with soil and color. Books once again pulled me into their quiet worlds, and laughter, soft, unexpected, found its way back into my days. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace, yet I knew there was one final reflection left to share. I took a quiet bus trip to the coast. Watching waves remind me of renewal. My journey taught me this self-worth outweighs family pressure. If my story touched you, please like, share, and leave your thoughts below.